Persian Empire was famous for its strong government, diverse cultures, and impressive infrastructure like roads and a postal system. They used official languages and had a large, structured army. One could say socially, Persia was ahead of its time. Despite these advancements, some of their punishments for crimes were considered sadistic or even too barbaric. From horrifying endless tortures to brutal executions, their cruel, punitive measures know no limit. Join us as we unveil this dark side of history, exploring the disgusting punishments in ancient Persia. History of the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire, also called the Achaemenid Empire, was an Iranian empire that began about 550 years before the Common Era. The empire's lands stretched from the Balkans and Egypt in the west to most of West Asia, much of Central Asia in the northeast, and all the way to the Indus Valley in the southeast. It was founded by Cyrus the Great, who belonged to the Achaemenid dynasty. This empire wasn't just one kingdom. It was more like a chain of empires ruled by different dynasties for almost 2,500 years. Its heartland was where modern-day Iran is located. Over time, 5 different dynasties controlled the Persian lands, starting with the Achaemenid dynasty, which had conquered territories previously ruled by the Babylonians, Lydians, and Medians. At its peak, the empire stretched across much of the ancient Middle East. It was the first Persian Empire, and it lasted until Alexander the Great took over. Its grand ceremonial capital was Persepolis, a city known for its luxury. The empire had various state governments to create and enforce laws. The First Persian Empire, along with later dynasties that revived it, generally avoided using slavery, except for prisoners captured during wars. This was unusual for that time and region. The empire also freed Jewish people from their exile in Babylon. Based in what is now Iran, it was the largest empire in history up to that point, covering about 5.5 million square kilometers, or a little more than 2 million square miles. By 330 years before the Common Era, the Achaemenid Empire was taken over by Alexander the Great. It was said that Alexander deeply admired Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian Empire. This conquest was seen as a major accomplishment in Alexander's campaign to expand the Macedonian Empire. After Alexander passed away, a new period known as the Hellenistic era began. Most of the territories that had once been part of the Achaemenid Empire ended up being controlled by the Ptolemaic Kingdom and the Seleucid Empire. These two powers were formed after the Macedonian Empire was divided during the partition of Triparadissus in 321 years before the Common Era. Hellenistic rule lasted for nearly 100 years before Iranian elites from the Central Plateau managed to regain control and establish the Parthian Empire. During the height of the Achaemenid Empire's influence, a historian named Herodotus wrote in the 5th century that Persian children were taught the importance of honesty. He mentioned that lying was considered the most terrible act anyone could commit in Persian society. It was even reported that lying could be punished by death. Death sentences for lying, as well as for other crimes, were carried out in ways that were extremely painful and could last for days. In this society, where lying was treated as a capital offense, punishment often involved methods meant to force people to confess or to make them suffer. Torture was used not just as a way to uncover the truth, but also as a means of execution. The Persians reportedly devised many cruel ways to torture those who were either guilty of crimes or even just suspected of wrongdoing. While lying was one of the crimes that could lead to death, punished just as severely, with harsh methods designed to inflict intense pain. Punishments for less serious crimes were also common, and were designed to make sure the guilty person could be easily recognized. Thieves and others who committed small crimes sometimes had their hands cut off, especially if they were strong enough to use them for more stealing. People who were caught supporting liars had their ears removed, and for certain offenses, feet were cut off. In some cases, pins were pushed into people's eyes, leaving them blind. Not only thieves, but also beggars were at risk of losing their hands if village judges decided it was the right punishment. Whipping, often called striping, was another form of punishment. Although it could last for several days, it was usually seen as less severe than other methods. The fact is, harsher punishments for various crimes were inflicted on offenders during the height of the Persian Empire. We begin by looking into a very distasteful one next. Flaying. During the time of the First Persian Empire, it was reported that criminals were often put to death after being tortured multiple times. For some serious crimes, people were first blinded, then stripped, and finally flayed alive. This means their skin was removed in strips while they were still living, which made the process slow and incredibly painful. Sometimes the skin was taken off in small pieces, prolonging the suffering, while other times it was removed all at once. Research has shown that in most cases, death was caused by heart failure. There were also situations where only a few strips of skin were removed, and the person was left to die later from cold or infections caused by the wounds. Flaying wasn't an invention of the Persians. The Babylonians and Assyrians had used this method before the Persians rose to power. Magistrates from the four regions of the Achaemenid dynasty often wrote about such punishments. In one documented case, a judge was sentenced to death by flaying. The skin from his body was then used to cover a chair that was given to the next judge, who happened to be the son of the one who had been put to death. This new judge was reminded every day of his father's fate and warned about what would happen to him if he engaged in corrupt practices while holding office. If that sounds bad, just wait. There's more to come. Suffocation by ash. The Persians reportedly used ashes in terrifying ways to execute thieves, methods that would seem unimaginable today. One method involved placing the person in a room where the floor was covered with several feet of ash. The victim would be forced to stand until they became too weak and collapsed. Over the course of several days, they would slowly suffocate from inhaling the ash. They were given no food or water. So many also died from hunger alongside the suffocation. Another method, mentioned in both the Bible's second book of Maccabees and the works of Valerius Maximus, a Roman historian from the time of Emperor Tiberius, used a tower partially filled with ash. The person was dropped into the tower, and paddles buried in the ash were connected to wheels outside the structure. Executioners turned the wheels, causing the paddles to stir up the ash, which the victim would breathe in until they suffocated. This method was used in around 162 years before the Common Era to execute Menelaus, a Jewish high priest in Jerusalem. He had been accused of plotting against the government, which was one of the few crimes punished this way. As awful as that sounds, the next punishment was considered even worse. Scaphism. The phrase, "a land flowing with milk and honey" in the Christian Bible's Book of Exodus has often been interpreted to describe the Promised Land as a fertile and abundant place. However, the Persians had a very different and horrifying use for milk and honey in ancient times. This involved a gruesome form of execution that started with forcing the prisoner to drink a mix of milk and honey. Afterward, the person would be placed in a vat or a small boat with only their head and limbs exposed, while the rest of their body was enclosed by another vat or boat. The same milk and honey mixture was smeared on their exposed skin. This contraption would then be floated on a pond or any still body of water. The milk and honey caused severe diarrhea, which made the victim even thirstier. Flies and other biting insects drawn to the mixture would swarm the exposed parts of their body. Over time, maggots would hatch in the decaying flesh, and the person's body would begin to decompose while they were still alive. Trapped in their own waste, the victim's skin became even more vulnerable to parasites. Helpless, they could not fend off the relentless attack from insects. This horrifying method, now known as scaphism, is said to have been used in ancient Persia, though modern scholars debate whether these accounts are true. Still, the next punishment on record was just as horrifying and well documented. Buried alive. It was reported by Herodotus that during Xerxes' campaign in Greece, there were cases where victims were buried alive with their heads facing downward in the ground. This was reportedly done in Thrace, where Persian magi were said to have ordered the burial of 9 Greek boys and 9 Greek girls. It seemed this act was carried out for religious reasons rather than as a punishment for crimes. Herodotus also described another instance where a dozen Persian noblemen were buried alive by the order of King Cambyses. He claimed that no clear reason was given for this act and suggested that it reflected the king's apparent insanity, a claim supported by other stories about Cambyses. There were also accounts of similar acts being ordered by Persian queens, including Queen Amestris, who was married to Xerxes. Herodotus wrote that Amestris had 14 children from Persian noble families buried alive, head down, as a way to show gratitude to the gods of the earth for blessing her with a long life. Beyond Herodotus's writings, there are no additional records confirming that burying people alive was practiced for criminal punishment or religious ceremonies. Still, what comes next is a punishment that is even harder to imagine in terms of the suffering it caused. Death by molten metal. It was said that Queen Parysatis punished people who lied by pouring molten metal into their ears and onto their eyes. Ancient Persian texts often mentioned molten metal as a way to test someone's soul. According to these stories, if a soul was pure, the molten metal wouldn't harm the person. But if they were guilty of lying or trusting lies, the metal would hurt them badly. Most historians believe that the story about Queen Parysatis using molten metal isn't true, but many people think the Persians did use molten substances, including gold, as a way to punish criminals. There is also a story about the Persian king Shapur I capturing the Roman emperor Valerian. It was said that Valerian was forced to serve Shapur as a servant. Some believe this is where the idea of the Persians pouring molten metal into people started. After Valerian was held captive for some months, it was claimed that Shapur put him to death by pouring molten gold down his throat. The story goes on to say that Valerian's body was then stuffed and put on display. However, Roman writers who disliked the Persians probably made up this tale of execution by gold. In reality, Valerian and his soldiers were captured and made to work on engineering projects near the city of Bishapur, including building Caesar's Dam. Once the dam was completed, they were reportedly released, but there were even more terrible punishments. Keep watching to learn about them. Death by tree. A British magazine was first to publish that the Persians had a unique way of executing thieves, but the details were mostly based on stories with little proof. The magazine, called the British Register, Volume 34, claimed that all these executions were ordered by the Persian king, who was said to never forgive thieves. However, Persian law typically punished theft by cutting off the guilty person's hands instead of executing them. According to the British Register, This execution method involved bending the trunks of two trees toward each other and tying them together with ropes. The convicted thief would then be tied between the trees, with one arm and one leg secured to each tree. Once the ropes holding the trees were cut, the trunks would snap back to their natural positions, tearing the thief in half. The two halves of the body were left hanging from the trees, which were often located along busy roads. This gruesome display was meant to scare others from robbing travelers. There is little evidence to confirm that the Persians actually used this method. The story mainly comes from British diplomat James Morier, who wrote about it in the British Register in the year 1808 after visiting the Persian king. The next punishment, however, has roots that go back much further than the Persian Empire itself. Stoning. Stoning has been mentioned in many ancient writings, including the Old and New Testaments, the works of Josephus, and accounts by Herodotus. These sources describe it as a way to put someone to death by throwing stones at them, and it is said to still happen in some places today. According to the biblical accounts, death was caused by repeated blows from stones. In Persia, heavy stones were also used for punishment in different ways. One method involved placing a large stone on a person's chest and gradually adding more weight. Eventually, the pressure became so great that the person's muscles couldn't hold up, and they suffocated. A similar technique was reportedly used in colonial America against people accused of witchcraft. Another way was simply hitting someone over the head with a heavy stone. This brutal method was mostly reserved for people of lower social classes, like servants or the poor. Servants of nobles could even be punished with stoning for crimes committed by their employers. It was dangerous to accuse nobles of wrongdoing because they were often related to powerful families through blood or marriage, which could cause political problems. Persian justice was tough, though, and in some cases, it even punished members of the king's own family. Stay tuned, as the next punishment is one you might already know about. Crucifixion. Many ancient cultures used crucifixion as a form of execution, but the Romans were the most infamous. Typically, victims weren't nailed to a cross, but were tied to a crossbeam and hung from it, where they would slowly die from asphyxiation. In Persia, those executed on a cross often had both hands bound to the upright pole, rather than being spread out on a crossbeam. Crucifixion was considered the most painful and shameful way to die. The term excruciating even comes from the Latin phrase for out of the cross. The victim could remain captive for several days before dying. After death, the Persians continued the humiliation by leaving the body on display, hanging from a pole or cross, so that everyone could see it as it rotted and was attacked by animals and the elements. Many ancient groups practiced crucifixion for serious offenses, including the Persians, Mesopotamians, Greeks, Assyrians, Israelites, Carthaginians, and Romans. Those who were thieves or rebels were sometimes crucified instead of being buried or burned. For example, Polycrates of Samos was put to death, and his body was left on display by crucifixion until nature took its toll. But if you think humans could only be put to death once, the Persians believed otherwise. Here's what they believed next. Death more than once. As one of the first mythologies to do so, Persian folklore had very vivid and detailed descriptions of the afterlife, including the end of the world, as it was described. Getting to heaven was like having to cross a bridge. Those who lived good lives would cross a wide, easy bridge, while those who lived bad lives would cross a narrow bridge that looked like the edge of a very sharp blade from which the wicked would fall into hell below. Persian executions were sometimes planned not only for the wicked to die a horrible death on earth, but also for them to suffer another terrible fate in the afterlife, where they would be unable to find peace forever. In Persian mythology, the gods and stories here on earth took care of death. The Persians made sure that some of their torture victims were almost murdered before the torture stopped, and the victim was either brought back to health or given enough time to get strong enough that the torture could continue for a while. This meant that Persian executioners had to be very skilled. If an executioner's victim died too soon, in the eyes of the judge who ordered the execution, he could be tortured, and even his own life is at stake. Unfortunately, the punishments didn't stop there, as we move on to a series of the most unimaginable forms of impalement. Impalement. Putting a criminal on a sharp stick and driving it through the ground was a method of executing people in the ancient world, and in some Western European countries well into the 16th century and even later. Herodotus wrote that when Darius, king of Persia, took over Babylon, he put more than 3,000 prisoners on spikes. Records of Darius himself support this. The Bible isn't clear on whether Haman, a Persian minister, and his 10 sons were put to death by hanging or being hung. There is some confusion because of the many translations and changes, but it is well known that the Persians used impalement as a method of execution. Many crimes, including stealing from customers by lying during business deals, which was considered theft, were deadly crimes, and other offenses that might not seem very serious could also lead to execution by impalement. It was up to the person being impaled to choose which method to use, and how long the witnesses and judge wanted the criminal to suffer before letting them die was a factor in choosing the method of impalement. All types of impalement were done in public, which made the victim feel even worse because they were in a lot of physical pain and waiting to die, which could take 2 days or more. If you think regular impalement was bad, wait until you hear about the other 2 methods, which are even worse. Longitudinal impalement. A criminal who had been sentenced to longitudinal impalement was placed face down on a slab, and a cut was made in his body near the rectum. The cut was then sealed with a greasy paste to stop the flow of blood and assist with the next step. Afterward, a pail was inserted into the wound and driven toward the head, while executioners held the body in place and used a heavy hammer to force it through. Most of the time, the executioners stopped before the tip of the stake reached the heart. People said the top of the stick was about the size of a man's arm. Even though the entry was very painful, the real agony of being impaled had not yet begun. The pail was then raised, and care was taken to ensure the victim's weight wouldn't push the stake deeper into his body and put him to death too soon. Struts were used to keep the subject in place and to hold up the stake, which was sometimes placed in a gibbet like the ones used for hangings. Because there were struts, the victim didn't have to fight his pain too hard, and the grease helped control blood loss. If the victim didn't die quickly, the judge might have some pity and change his position so that the stake's tip came out of his chest, allowing the victim to die quickly. Others just left them to die in the end. Have you heard about transversal impalement? Well, if not, you're about to. Transversal impalement. Transversal impalement, where the stake or pail was driven through the body from front to back or back to front, could put anyone to death almost instantly, or take longer and be more painful depending on where in the torso the stake was placed. In Persian culture, horizontal impalement was seen as a more humane way to carry out the death penalty because the victims usually died quickly. People have said that the Persians also impaled people by hanging them from meat hooks or using other methods, but there isn't much proof that they did these things. They did use horrible methods to impale people, so there was no need to make them more horrific. A third method of impalement thought to have been used by the Persians was called rectal impalement. In this method, the stake wasn't sharpened, but was left round on purpose. The victim was held up with ropes so that he couldn't slide further down the stake and die too soon. The stake was inserted far enough that the victim had to stand on his toes. Depending on how long the subject had been on the stake, the struts could be removed, allowing him to push himself down and die more quickly. People put to death by anal impalement suffered longer than those who were executed by other methods. The Persians eventually switched from impalement to hanging, which made impalement less popular as a method of execution. But before making that switch, they punished their criminals using this infamous next method: dismemberment. In Persia and the surrounding nations, it was fairly common to torture rebels by cutting off their noses, ears, and sometimes their tongues. This kind of brutal punishment wasn't always a death sentence. Sometimes it kept people alive, and sometimes that was far worse than dying. When people revolted against King Darius, he made it clear what would happen if anyone turned against him again. He rounded up the rebel leaders, cut off their noses, ears, and tongues, and plucked out one of each of their eyes. But he didn't execute them. Not yet. The rebel leaders were chained up and bound to the front gate of his castle so that everyone who passed by could see their mutilated bodies. Their lieutenants, meanwhile, were decapitated and their heads were hung from the top of the city citadel. They were left there for weeks, jeered at and beaten by everyone who passed by, staring at the remains of their friends and suffering in excruciating pain. Then, when they couldn't take it anymore, they were finally allowed to die. But if you think that's bad, wait until you hear about the terrible holiday the Persians celebrated next. Massacre Holiday. In Persia, the Zoroastrian priests were known as the Magi. This didn't mean they were magic wielders, they were religious leaders. But after one of them got a bit too ambitious, their lives turned into a nightmare. A Magi named Smerdis tricked the people into thinking he was the son of Cyrus the Great and got himself crowned as king of Persia. He was actually a great king, beloved by his people. He introduced tax reforms that made life easier and relaxed the laws on military conscription. But because he stole the throne, he had to die. When people found out, they didn't just stop at murdering Smerdis. They raced through the streets of the kingdom, spreading the news and murdering every Magi they could find. After the massacre, the people decided to make it an annual event. Once a year, the Persians would celebrate a holiday called the Slaughter of the Magi. On the anniversary of Smerdis's death, they would run through the streets, and if they caught any Magi outside, they would brutally murder them. And if that wasn't enough, they were also known to punish children. Find out the gruesome details next. Infanticide, cannibalism. A Median general named Harpagus experienced the harshest punishment for a minor offense. King Astyages had a dream that his grandson would overthrow him. So he ordered Harpagus to take the infant out into the wilderness and leave him to die. However, Harpagus instead gave the baby to a shepherd who raised the child as his own. It took 10 years for Astyages to find out he'd been disobeyed. When he did, he was merciless. He cut Harpagus's son's throat, chopped him into pieces, roasted his flesh, and served it to Harpagus at a banquet. At first, Harpagus didn't know what he was eating or even that his son was dead. However, Astyages made his servants place the dead boy's head on the table in front of him and taunted him, saying, "Do you know what beast's meat you have eaten?" Harpagus knew the fate that awaited him if he tried to seek revenge. He couldn't even dare to cry in front of the king who had murdered and fed him his own son. "I know," Harpagus was forced to say, "and all that the king does is pleasing." He complimented Astyages on the dish and asked to take the leftovers with him. Then he carried what they'd let him take back home and buried the last remains of his son. Finally, let's conclude by examining the legal system that sanctioned these horrible punishments. The Persian legal system. The government of ancient Persia had a political body that made sure the king didn't abuse the rights of the empire's free people. Throughout the history of the 5 dynasties, many kings tried to misuse their power. Judges and magistrates heard cases of people accused of crimes. They reviewed the charges, ensured that the police hadn't gone beyond their authority when arresting people, and considered both the accuser's evidence and the accused's defense. Testimony was given under oath, and because the Persians didn't like lying, perjury was punished severely. The Persians even had bail set by the courts, for some cases still under review. In situations where physical or capital punishment wasn't necessary, defendants had the right to a lawyer, but they had to pay for one if their lawyer was present. Besides criminal courts, there were also ecclesiastical courts that handled family and religious issues, and the military had its own courts that had power over its members. Despite the fact that Persian punishments were often harsh, people found guilty of minor crimes were usually only fined or sent to jail for a short time. There were clear rules about what each family member had to do for one another and for Persian society, written down in Persian law. A lot of what has been said about ancient Persia actually comes from sources that experts started to question more and more in the late 20th century. This is especially true of some of the stories about abuse that have been told here and elsewhere. They were first written about in the West by Herodotus and a writer named Ctesias, who shows up a lot in Herodotus's writings. There were 23 volumes of Ctesias's History of Persia, which he called Persa. The volumes were the first to go into detail about the harsh punishments the Persians gave. Persa was written with Greeks in mind, comparing what Ctesias saw as a cruel and unjust system to the order and growth of the Greek city-states, especially Athens. A lot of what he said didn't match up with other records like the clay tablets of the Assyrians. A famous humorist from Syria named Lucian called Ctesias's work a mendacious history in his piece about sensationalist writers who make up stories called A True Story. In 1984, a more modern writer talked about how wrong Ctesias was and how Herodotus's work was a model of reliability in comparison. It's true that people in the past were sometimes very cruel, but some stories may have been exaggerated, and many current scholars agree. Thanks for watching. See you in our next video.